Hey, Jennifer, what's the question today?
Well, you know what, Dana, before we do the question, let's say hi to your co-pilot, Loki. Hi, Loki.
He just went to sleep. Let's not wake him up.
Okay, so I'm thinking that someone recently read one of your blog posts on pay equity because a reader wrote in and asked, how can I be a champion for, equity, pay equity in my organization? And I'm thinking maybe I should start perhaps sharing my salary with colleagues to figure out where we are and is that a good idea?
There's a big question. And first of all, yay for wanting to be a champion for equity in your company. As I said in the post, we talk about diversity and inclusion a lot, but equity is really kind of where the rubber meets the road, particularly with pay. If you're getting paid fairly and equitably, you can feel included, you feel valued in your organization. So yes, absolutely be a champion, and be a champion in the way that you're talking about, which is that when everybody else has equity, you have equity, and equity for you is equity for all. And that's really a very empowered concept, win-win, win for you, win for everybody else. So definitely good for that. It is a complicated topic. It's a very complicated topic, both for the company and for employees as individuals. So go in eyes open too, and be aware of how complicated a topic it is.
Well, yeah, I bet it is pretty complicated. So what are some of the pros and cons and the complicating factors that someone should think about?
Well, I think the easiest way to think about it is through the two lenses, the company's lens and the employee's lens. This question's coming from the employee, but the employee has to recognize that for a company to do this fairly, to put salary transparency into place fairly, requires a lot of policies and procedures. There are legal issues to be navigated, communicating fairly to everybody so everybody understands how it works and what the information they see on salary information that the company publishes. What does that mean? And what does it mean to me? There's a lot of issues there that a company needs to navigate. And for individuals, of course, if you're receiving that from the company, you have some guidance and some context in which to navigate this information you're getting about your salary and everybody else's. Without the company doing that, you have no context as an individual. So the complication there becomes, this is just caught up in interpersonal dynamics. If I know how much you make and you know how much I make, do we think that's fair? What do we know about why we make what we're learning we make? Plus now, how does it change how we see each other or how we work together? There's a lot of complications there. So the main thing to do as an individual, as you're considering this, is asking yourself, how can I be a champion for pay equity? How can I be a champion for equity in my company? Is not to be reactionary. Being reactionary about it and just sort of either sharing your salary or making judgments about what you learn about other people's salary in a reactionary way is a very out of power concept. And it can really take you and your colleagues into a negative space quickly if you're just kind of reacting and saying, oh, let's all share our salary.
So Dana, let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be proactive in this kind of a situation.
Yeah, well, so here's the best way to think about it. Being proactive around anything, being intentional and proactive, that is being in your power. That is being in an empower kind of a framework. So that's a general statement. But in the context of pay equity or pay salary at all, here's the context that matters. Whenever you're talking about salary, you are giving somebody negotiating leverage. So if you're talking about your salary to your colleagues, you're giving them negotiating leverage when they go to get a raise or additional compensation of any kind. And you're putting your employer at a disadvantage in that negotiation, because if the employer doesn't have a salary transparency policy, then they're taking advantage of the fact that you and your colleagues don't know what everybody gets paid. By the same token, if someone shares their salary with you, that gives you information that you can use in negotiations with your employer. That's all fine, but the point is you don't go into negotiations without being thoughtful about it, without knowing what you want, what's important to you, what your walk-away point is, having a strategy, having an understanding of, not only what you want, but who you're negotiating with and what their motivations are. So all of that requires being proactive and thoughtful and intentional about what information you're giving and getting and why and how you're going to use it and how other people are going to use it. And there's no right or wrong about that. The reason that companies put salary transparency in place is to even out that negotiating leverage, both for the company and for the employee, which is why it's a good thing. But when you're going into it just on your own, there's a lot of landmines there that can backfire on you, as you and I have both discovered, because when we were preparing for this video, we noticed that we have stories to tell. So maybe we should talk about that a little bit, and some of the challenges that you get into when you're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to put information out there to create more equity between you and your colleagues, and you have to be aware that things don't always work out just all peachy keen.
Yeah, we sure do have some stories to tell. So does that mean it's about time to go into the InPower dimension?
I think the InPower dimension is where we should take this. I'll see you there.
Okay. Okay, so here we are in the InPower dimension. Dana, you said you had a story to share, so what's going on?
Well, my story is simple, and it demonstrates why this is such a complicated topic. When I was 20, I was actually fired from a job, and I say fired because there was, the reason that was given to let me go was because I had looked at someone's salary when I was handing out paychecks. He gave me, my boss, it was a very small company, he gave me paychecks to hand out to other people. I don't know if I actually did or not. I honestly don't remember now, and I didn't remember then, but I was horrified, and I took away from that, oh, it's illegal, it's wrong to know other people's salaries. I didn't find out till years later. It's perfectly legal for people to know each other's salaries. And in fact, I'm fairly sure that that was not the reason I was let go. I'm pretty sure he was out of money and just didn't want to admit to it. But the point is that the corporate cultures that I was in at the time and that I've been in ever since actively discourage us as employees from sharing salaries, because it does diminish the negotiating leverage of the company. They don't like that. Mm-hmm. which demonstrates why it's sort of culturally uncomfortable to talk about it. I think your story actually demonstrates the interpersonal dimension of that discomfort even more. So talk about yours.
Yeah, so many years ago, I was part of a team that had been merged. Two small teams had been brought together, and so there were slightly different pay structures that we didn't know about. So I, too, accidentally was given information as part of the performance review process. I was supposed to have been given information on my direct reports. I had a team of 3 people, and instead I was given salary information on the entire department by accident. So, yeah, big oops. And in fact, that's essentially the look on my work team leader's face when I shared that with her, was a big oops. And what I discovered is that out of 5 of us with the same job description, 4 actually, were being paid significantly more than I was. And the 3 who had the highest salary did not have any direct reports, and then myself and one other team member who did have direct reports were being paid at a lower rate. So what that did for the interpersonal element is, there were a few weeks where I was pretty uncomfortable. I just was, I previously had just adored those work team members, still appreciated and respected them, but there was a little awkwardness because of course I was told, do not tell that we're just going to keep this to ourselves. And I should state that the work team leader was and is a mentor to me. I respect her tremendously, and she was a wonderful champion of my career for a long, long time. So it was just an awkward situation. And knowing what I know now, what I might have done is just asked for reasons why the pay discrepancy existed. And knowing what I know now about how corporate pay structures work and levels of experience and the valuation of certain skills over others, I think they could have made a case for underpaying me. I was the youngest person in the department. Some of the other team members had skills that I didn't have.
But it also made you feel undervalued, didn't it?
Temporarily, yes. Yes. And that is, as you say, just an example of what can happen when pay transparency occurs. But it doesn't have to, because I think you have another story as well. It doesn't have to cause a problem.
Well, exactly, because what it sounds like you learned in that circumstance, although albeit not because the company told you, but just because of what you came to understand, is that the company valued education over managerial responsibilities in terms of its pay scale, but they didn't state that. So you didn't have that information to go on. And it's interesting to me because our experiences we're sharing is kind of what my experience has been. And yet I stopped and thought about it. I thought, well, my husband's worked for the government for 30 years and everybody's always known what his GS level was and therefore his salary band. And we both know someone, Keegan, who told me a similar story of where he was working for a private company and they were going to go public and or be acquired. And the auditors came in and they said, your salaries are just all out of whack. And to value you appropriately, we really have to bring salaries into some kind of some kind of reality check. So they instituted salary transparency prior to the liquidity event. And it's interesting because I said to him, so how was that, to go through that where you went from not knowing anybody's salary to knowing everybody's salary? And he said, well, for a week, it was like the big gossip thing. Everybody's going to check what so-and-so makes. Oh, he makes that, she makes that, And after a week, it was just, nobody cared because everybody could go see, and then they could draw their own judgments. But now it was public information for the company. And I think that's the whole point of transparency, is to get to a point where when you learn things about what their pay grade is, you could go to somebody and say, why is that pay grade being, rewarded like this? And somebody would have an answer. And then you could still have opinions, but it wouldn't give you any more negotiating leverage. As a matter of fact, and here's the interesting thing, there are a lot of companies who are proactively choosing to go to salary transparency, not only for equity reasons, but because it's actually a recruiting tool. People like working in a place where they understand how they can get paid more. What do I have to do to get paid more? In your situation, you knew maybe you should go get a master's degree if you wanted to get paid more. At least that's something you could do about it. And that's the whole point of equity, right? Is that it is fair and there is information there about how you can be rewarded. Without having to just wait until somebody's unconscious bias is in your favor. So stories like these, I think, make the point that equity means transparency, and transparency means equity. And back to the question that was asked, should you start it by revealing your salary? That puts you in a potentially vulnerable situation. So I would be thoughtful about it, as we've already talked about, being proactive and intentional. And I would say that really, even before you do that, for your own good, you should find out if you're being paid fairly. And there are ways to do that without revealing your salary or asking other people for their salary. There's a lot of, if you Google, salary band, pay scales and salary scales, you can go in and look in your geography, for your market, for your job classification, even for your title, what are average salaries. And that tells you something. But then what you can do is, this is what I've done my entire career, and it works really well. You can talk to others in your field who work for other companies, who work for your company, and sort of say, well, for this work, is this salary range realistic? And people then, they're not put on the spot to say, yes, $78,000 is exactly what you should be being paid. They can say, well, that's a little high or a little low. And so it's a way to get people to reveal information about salaries without revealing their own salary or somebody else's salary, which may be either uncomfortable, or here's the other factor, when you're finding out if you're paid fairly, and you're talking about salary, remember to look at your employee agreement. Remember to look at your NDAs you might have signed, any confidentiality agreements. There are things that when you join a company or other people join a company, there are legal documents you sign, and some of them may have statements in there that make you vulnerable if you start giving away specific salary information. When you're talking salary ranges and generalities, most of those things do not apply. So if you have any question whatsoever, talk to an employment attorney. But coming back to the main point, it's totally valid to want to find out if you are being paid fairly. And there are a lot of ways to find that out. And that tells you two things. Are you being paid fairly? And that's negotiating leverage for you when you go for a salary increase. But it also tells you something about whether your company is really being fair or unfair. So going back to the questioner's desire to have equity and to know that there is equity for themselves and for everybody else, it's good to find out if there's reason to believe there's inequity before you kind of take this on as a challenge, particularly if the company has policies in place that are not putting people at a disadvantage. You don't want to accuse them of it and only create a conflict situation that may not even be valid. So go in eyes open and find out to the best of your ability whether you personally are being paid fairly before you go any further.
So Dana, you've been doing a great job talking about some of the reasons why you might or might not want to talk to people about your salary. So the first thing that I want to offer as an observation as a former HR generalist is that it's not illegal to discuss your salary with colleagues. There was actually an act passed in 1935. It's called the National Labor Relations Act, and it is not illegal to discuss your salary. But as Dana mentioned prior, at the top of this video, you may have signed other agreements that prohibit you from sharing this kind of information. So just know, like a non-disclosure agreement or whatever, just know that that might prohibit you. But in general, it's not illegal. Couple of other things, if you're kind of interested in learning more about this topic and what your rights as a worker are, there is the EEOC.gov site, and that contains just a plethora of information, more than you probably ever wanted to know about employment law and your rights. It's a pretty deep dive. It's well laid out. The site is well laid out. So you might want to go take a look there. If that feels really intimidating or overwhelming or too detailed when you get there, there's another website that Dana and I endorse, which is called workplacefairness.org. And that is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to informing workers about their rights. And so it's just a really great site to kind of dip your toes into this topic. So those are the two areas that I would say you might want to consider if you have some sort of thought that maybe your rights aren't being honored as an employee.
And I just have to throw out there that if you look at resources like that, you get information, you talk to people about salary ranges and have the feeling like there is some kind of discrimination going on, you really do need to talk to an employment attorney. And I can say I had a client once who was in a discriminatory situation. She had an attorney and she had me as her coach. And it really opened my eyes to the complexity of this issue legally for her. And the attorney was absolutely critical to her exiting effectively without having it affect her reputation and making sure she was compensated appropriately. And she leaned very heavily on me for the interpersonal and personal aspects of this, because seeing what she had to go through the legalities of it. Now, this wasn't, an effort to change the company. This was an effort for her to get out fairly from a discriminatory situation. But it was highly uncomfortable for her to be going to work every day, knowing that this was going on, having, these uncomfortable topics out in the company, even though they all tried to keep it to a minimum number of people. The leadership knew, the legal team knew, her boss knew, obviously, et cetera. Very uncomfortable, very hard for her. And so going back to my core advice, if you want to take on discrimination in any form for yourself, for others, you have to be, it's tempting to say you have to be tough. I don't want to say that. You have to be open, you have to be compassionate, but you have to be able to handle a lot of discomfort, your own and other people's. And that is an InPower skill, getting to the point where you're okay with discomfort because it has a purpose. It has a purpose for you, it has a purpose for others. And particularly if you're fighting for fairness and equity, that's a wonderful purpose to hold on to. It's going to cause discomfort if there's actual inequity and unfairness going on. To be successful, you have to be uncomfortable. You have to make other people uncomfortable. And it is an InPower skill to be okay with that, to go into that knowingly and proactively. You have to be de-triggered. You have to be able to manage your emotions. I'm not saying you have to be unemotional, because you won't be. You won't be effective if you're unemotional. But you have to be able to manage your emotions. You have to be intentional. These are all very core InPower skills. And my experience with my client showed me just how complicated that was in the context of a discrimination situation. So I go back to what I said originally. Equity for you is equity for all. And that is a wonderful purpose. It is something that I think should drive you. And you need to be in your power to be successful navigating that, regardless of how it comes out. So go in eyes open, be emotionally ready for the discomfort that you're going to experience. Be intentional and be committed. And know that if you're really in it for equity for yourself and for everybody else, then the journey is going to teach you something. It's going to grow you. Hopefully it'll grow your company. It'll allow your company and your colleagues to all achieve a level of equity and fairness that benefits everybody. But this is dangerous territory on the emotional side. So eyes open. And if you do want help, I now have experience in helping people navigate through that, and I would be happy to help you. But more power to you on your journey, wherever it takes you.